I'm Acorn, and I did my master's in gender studies in London. So I'm going to be talking a bit about gender in Cymbeline. And my master's was looking at all-female contemporary performances of Shakespeare. I looked at Taming of the Shrew and Julius Caesar. And I interviewed Phil and Sue as part of my research. So I've been a kind of hanger-on at the Willow Globe for about 10 years, just helping out in the office and doing workshops. And so a lot of you I have met or I recognize. So, but this is really a nice chance to get to see you all and be part of one of your productions. And so these are my reflections. I'm going to talk at the beginning a little bit about the context of gender at the time when this play was written, and then give my reflections about gender and performativity within the play itself. And then hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion, particularly about how we view this play now in our 21st century eyes, and then this activity. So before we start, a little bit on why gender. So the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir stated that one is not born a woman, one becomes one. And this underpins the idea of performativity, which is a word that I'll use a lot, which basically recognizes that gender and the way that we express being men or women are not fixed, but are guided by social norms. In 1990, Judith Butler wrote a seminal work called Gender Trouble. And she argued that from the moment we're born, we undergo a process of gendering. And through repetitive acts, we come to understand ourselves and the world around us through the lenses of gender. So that's not to say that every day I can just change my gender and become a man or become a different kind of woman, or perform my gender totally differently. But it challenges the idea that gender as a thing is fixed and unbending. And my studies kind of meet at the crossroads of this idea of performativity and performance. So the stage is a very, very beautifully rich place for exploring ideas about the human condition, gender being one of these, and playing with possibilities about who we are as human beings. And I think that Shakespeare is exemplary in his quest to delve into what it is to be a human. And there are many, many examples of him scrutinizing our performances of gender, and many characters who disrupt social norms of gender, and disrupt our ideas about what it means to be a man or be a woman. And Cymbeline has got all these elements. So I didn't know this play well at all before Amy asked me to come and speak. And I'm sad about that, because I think if I had known about it when I was writing my thesis, I would have definitely talked about it a lot, because it's a fascinating play, and I think there are some very beautifully complex ideas about gender in this play. So before we look at Cymbeline itself, let's look at the context in which it was first written and performed. So the first references Cymbeline are from about 1610, 1611. King James I of England, 6th of Scotland, had been on the throne for about 6 or 7 years at this point. And despite before this having lived through a very long period of having a woman as a head of state, women's roles in society at this time are still extremely fixed and prescribed. The woman's place was as a wife and a mother inside the home without independent means. She might have had some property to her name, but at marriage, this would have been transferred over to her husband. And an unmarried woman was considered a burden on her family. On the public stage, all parts for women were played by young boys who from about the age of 12 were apprenticed out to older actors who would teach them how to perform on stage. There was an association between acting and sex work. And so that meant that any woman who dared to go on stage, even just to sing or dance, was at serious risk of social censure. However, there are some accounts of women on stage during Shakespeare's lifetime. In the early 1600s, we have a record of a troupe of French performers who came to London and caused an enormous scandal because some of their performers were women. And that was considered very taboo and corrupting to the masses. But we also have records that Queen Anne, the wife of James I, enjoyed throwing masked balls where her and her ladies would perform. They would perform as fairies or spirits, but always in complete silence. And there would be men on stage with them dressed as witches, and the role of the Queen and her ladies was to scare away these evil spirits. But despite that, laws did not change until 1661, when King Charles II, Restoration King, allowed women on the public stage for the first time. Just another note, this is something I'm not an expert on, but I think it's interesting, particularly in the context of this play, that something we need to remember is that during this time, there are very, very strict sumptuary laws. So that means that all of the laws surrounding the color and the material and the types of clothing that people were allowed to wear was very, very strict. You were not allowed to dress out of your station, out of your gender. For example, during Shakespeare's time, all males over the age of 6 had to wear a woolen cap on Sundays and saints' days, or they would be fined. So that's just an interesting note. It's not something I'm going to go into a lot, but something to think about. So because of these very prescribed gender roles, it's fascinating to see quite how much Shakespeare as a playwright draws our attention to gender and performance within his plays. The fact of having young boys playing the women was a very rich source of comedy, and Shakespeare definitely plays with his audience's knowledge of this. So in Cymbeline, Guiderius's infatuation with Fidel/Imogen, and Imogen saying things like, "I'm almost a man now," would have guaranteed a laugh from the audience. But I would argue that Shakespeare is not only trying to get us to laugh when he's playing with these gender disruptions, he's also getting us to think about society and think about ourselves and ask questions. So I'm just going to have a little sip of water. Let's look at the play. So when we're talking about gender and how it can be understood as a performance, let's first think about the characters who appear to perform their gender along the lines of social norms. So let's say for men, that's about being brave, strong, loyal, just. And for women, that's about being faithful, obedient, kind, submissive. So let's look at which characters seem to go in line with those norms, and then how those norms get disrupted and called into question in this play. So I would argue that the characters who perform their idealized version of their gender, in the most exemplary way in this play, are the king's, Cymbeline's lost sons. They are close to nature, they're able to fight, they're strong, they're loyal to their supposed father, they want to adventure, they hunt, they've transcended the need for money and earthly ties, they live like aesthetes in the wild, they're kind and hospitable to strangers, they appear to be quite wise and even-tempered, and then in the end they become war heroes and they save the king. Guiderius does murder Cloten, but he tries not to, he really tries not to fight him, and in the end he kind of acts out of defense. So I would say that those are kind of held up as like recognizable ideas of manhood in this play. By contrast, the other men in this play don't appear to live up to these noble standards set by Cymbeline's sons. And we could go so far as to say that they're trying, the other men's attempts to try to live up to idealized standards of manhood and masculinity is actually what leads to their downfall in various ways. So for example, Posthumus is obsessed with the loyalty of his wife and her being faithful to him and him being a man who can keep his wife satisfied, which leads him astray. It allows him to place a bet on his wife's honor and nearly has them both killed, or certainly gets them both into a lot of trouble. Then we have the philandering Giacomo, who wants to look like he's a brilliant success with women and that he can seduce anybody. And that leads him to lies, to deception. And even though in the end he's forgiven, he's ultimately the villain of the posthumous Imogen story. And then we have Cloten, who the first thing we learn about him is that he's really smelly and that he's always spoiling for a fight. He's really not the brightest button in the box, let's say. And his desire to fight and get into scrapes all the time and prove his strength is ultimately what gets him killed. And then even the eponymous king, at the beginning at least, doesn't seem to fit noble ideals. He seems to be easily manipulated by the queen. He doesn't have control over his daughter, and he has to be rescued from the battle. Although at the end, he is the one who restores order. He agrees to pay tribute to Rome once more, which is something he blames the queen from having dissuaded him from doing. He accepts his daughter's marriage, and he's shown to have sons and heirs, and he shows justice and mercy by pardoning the wrongdoers. So Cymbeline's development throughout the play is really interesting, and if he can change, then why can't others? So the question is, does anybody come close to these idealized gender roles? So, well, now I want to mention the place where we learn the most about gender, the kind of most obvious study into the performance of gender in this play, and that is with Imogen and her alter ego, Fidel. Do we say Fidel, or how are you guys pronouncing?
Fideli.
Fideli, okay, Fideli. So as Imogen, she kicks off the whole play by defying her father. And she seems to stand out as strong-willed. She knows her own mind. And that's something that we can only admire today, but it did not fit in with the prescribed gender roles at the time, and would have been quite shocking, I think, for the people watching this for the first time. However, after that, she does resist the advances of the other men, and she remains honest and loyal to her husband throughout. It's when she dresses up as a man, which is a very common Shakespearean comedy trick, that we start to see how complex and interesting this play can be when it comes to ideas about the performance of gender and who inhabits masculine and feminine roles. So despite all the men around her trying and failing to be manly men, I think it's very interesting that when Imogen is discovered, or Fidele is discovered guarding the body of whom she supposes to be her master, it's the Roman soldiers who say, "This boy hath taught us manly duties." So by having what would have been a man playing a woman playing a man hold a candle up to the other men, I would argue that Shakespeare in this play is calling into question the whole idea of fixed prescribed gender roles, because he's playing with our fundamental preconceptions, and he gives us a chance to ask questions about this very basic element, this kind of fundamental element of our own being. So, Cymbeline now, how do we look at this play today? All in all, women in this play are not treated very well, I think. Clotton blames his mother for the fact that no one wants to fight him. Cymbeline blames the queen for leading him down a particular political path. And when Posthumus thinks that Imogen has committed adultery, he rails against women and says some pretty nasty things. So it's therefore quite surprising that the women are able to be as strong as they are. Imogen defies her father to marry for love, and then does something very radical by dressing as a man in order to keep herself safe and find out what has really happened. And then even though all her scheming doesn't work and ultimately she dies off stage, the queen certainly knows her own power and her own strength. And she's very happy to use others as pawns in her own scheming at court. She's also obviously very clever. She has a grasp of politics, and she's interested in learning, even though it is about poison. So in terms of how we look at this play today, these things, along with Shakespeare's questioning of gender through Imogen Fidele, I think makes this a very beautiful, complex, interesting play. And even though it's written 500 years ago, it can give us very fresh perspectives on how we view our life now. Things like various waves of feminism, the development of gender studies and its movement into mainstream, and even the Me Too movement will all inform how we feel about this play and understandings of what it is to be a man or a woman. And I'll be very interested in your thoughts on this in just a sec. But my final point is I do think this play has a rebellious heart. Despite its patriarchal setting and some of the not so great things said about women, Shakespeare is doing what he does best. He's holding up a mirror to the society we live in as well as ourselves. Gender is just one lens through which Shakespeare helps us examine these deep parts of the human psyche. How we perform our gender and how society tells us to perform our gender is something so ingrained and fundamental, most of us don't notice that we're even doing it. But gender performativity in performance is an endlessly rich and interesting ground for asking questions, at least for me. Yeah. And the wonder of bringing these ideas into the theatre is that the theatre is a place for play, it's about openness, it's about liberation, and the beauty of doing that through Shakespeare is that he bends but never breaks. So those are some of my thoughts and reflections. I would be very interested to know what you as performers, because I'm not coming from a performance perspective, but from the academic side. So you as performers, I'd be fascinated to know your reflections and your thoughts, and whether you agree with my ideas or whether you fundamentally disagree with some of the things that I'm saying. So I'd like to now go over to you guys and ask what you think and what your feelings are about this, frankly,
thank you. That was
incredible
wonderful.
play.
Beautiful, thank you.
A pleasure.
Yes.
My pleasure, thank you.